crafting the masterpiece that is One-Winged Angel, trusting your gut in the stagnation of video game music. These are all topics from legendary composer Nobuo Uematsu that we'll be breaking down in today's video. So, let's talk about it. So I think it's pretty fair to say that Uematsu-san is a legendary composer. I've said this in previous videos. I put him up there with classical composers like Beethoven and Mozart and Bach. What this man has been able to come up with in his incredibly impressive and long storied career is just absolutely amazing. He has created the soundtracks for so many of our favorite games and honestly scored my childhood. So whenever we get a peek into the mind of this man on how he makes music or what his current thoughts are on music in video games, I think it's really interesting. And we start off first with how he crafted the masterpiece that is One-Winged Angel. Now this comes to us from the Japanese YouTube channel Newspicks. However, we're pulling from the translation from Automaton that was written by Verity Townsend. So thank you to Verity for writing up this translation. Now this starts off with Uematsu coming off of Final Fantasy VI. And if you've played Final Fantasy VI, you know it has one of the greatest final battle themes probably in any video game with Dancing Mad. And Uematsu realizes, oh crap, I have to find a way to make something that is just as good, if not better. But how do I do that? Dancing Mad, I believe, is around 20 minutes long, and it scores every different phase of the fight you have with Kefka. It's so beautifully done, it's incredible. And to craft One-Winged Angel, Uematsu would take a pretty different approach. Instead of composing a song like you normally would, where you write one or two melodies, a chorus, maybe a bridge, and then the ending, he decided to work on this song in chunks. So he decided every day for 3 weeks, he would go to work, sit down, and just think about the character of Sephiroth, and whatever came to his mind, he wrote down in the form of music. And after those 3 weeks, he came up with the proper amount of measures he would need to put everything together to create a song. And that's honestly super cool. Instead of starting just from the beginning like you normally would, creating these jigsaw pieces, as Automaton puts it, and then crafting them together is incredibly impressive. But also, to think about it in the way that he did, where he didn't just want to write something, he actually thought about Sephiroth. What would Sephiroth sound like? How does he as a character inspire a musical measure? Which I think is honestly one of the cool things about Uematsu, and again, it's why he's such a legendary composer, is he doesn't just stick to the status quo. Even when crafting a song, he thinks of all these different ways to make it unique. Now, what's super interesting is that when he finished One-Winged Angel and he took it to the dev team, they didn't like it at first. Uematsu would go on to say, "My colleagues asked me to make it more heroic." However, he would stick to his guns and keep the track the way it was, which is 100% the right move. And this is a really great example of being a creative, whether it's a composer, a writer, a director, actor, what have you, of sticking to your guns, sticking to your original vision of what you've created and not letting anyone really change that. But it's also a really great example of the developers, even though they didn't care for the song at first, they trusted him because it's Uematsu-san. This man has created so many legendary tracks up to the point of Final Fantasy VII that they're like, okay, we trust you. Whatever you think is best is probably going to be best. And thankfully, we ended up with the One-Winged Angel we hear in the game. And I just got to gush over this song very quickly, but I remember getting to Bizarro Sephiroth as a kid, and he looked frightening. You're in this weird area within the earth. You're on these 3 different rock platforms that are red. There's the holy materia behind you, and Sephiroth has turned into this super jacked, gray, demonic angel monster looking thing that once you take it down, the screen goes black, and it stays black for a while. And then you hear the opening lines of One-Winged Angel, which scared the crap out of me as a kid. It sounded like something out of a horror movie. I felt like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees was coming after me, and I did not know what was happening. Like, I just beat Sephiroth, right? What more could there be? Eventually, that black screen turns into this really crazy, vivid dreamscape that's almost like you're fighting in heaven, or one of the Doctor Who portals as the TARDIS is traveling through time. It kind of reminds me of that too. And there you are, face to face with this bastardized version of what Sephiroth thinks is a god or an angel. It's blasphemous, I think some people would probably think. But listening to that track, it's scary, it's terrifying, it's menacing. very much like the character of Sephiroth. And Uematsu knew he had to make a song that perfectly reflected that character, but also perfectly reflected that final battle. It's not a super easy fight when you get there. Maybe nowadays it's kind of simple for people, but back when you first got to that version of Sephiroth, Safer Sephiroth, he was scary. When he cast Supernova on you and just obliterated you, it was horrifying, and it probably ended a lot of playthroughs. But as that song goes and it builds up more and more, it really feels like you're in the fight for your life to take this dude out once and for all. And even though it is very scary and menacing, there are moments where, much like Sephiroth, it's kind of regal, it's kind of elegant. It has this section where it feels like it's kind of dancing on a ballroom floor. That's how incredible this theme is. It's so dynamic. And it's great that Uematsu-san had the foresight to be like, no, look, this theme is what it is. It reflects that final battle. It's what needs to happen. I think is really wonderful. And it's kind of funny, when you look back at the original development of Final Fantasy VII OG, there are some things that could have gone way off the rails. There's not just this story of them wanting him to change One-Winged Angel, which would go on to become one of the most iconic songs in Final Fantasy. I honestly think if you were to ask a Final Fantasy fan what's their favorite final battle theme, they're probably either gonna say Dancing Mad or One-Winged Angel. Those two are absolute masterpieces. But there's also the incredibly classic story that Nomura likes to recall, where Kitase and Kazushige Nojima, who was the scenario writer of the OG FF7, wanted to kill off like most of the cast. So originally on your return to Midgar, their plan was to kill all but 3 characters. And I don't recall if they had designated which characters would die or if it was up to the player depending on who you put in your party. And Nomura was the voice of reason in that situation. He's like, no, we can't do that. We've already killed Aerith in this game. If we then take out the rest of the party, Aerith's death loses that emotional impact. So it's kind of funny how some crazy things almost happened in that OG development that could have changed the course of that game permanently. Now, what is kind of ironic is that the dev team wanted a heroic version of One-Winged Angel. And it's funny because if you look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, at the beginning of that game, when you're in the Nibelheim flashback and you're with good guy Sephiroth, you get to hear a heroic version of One-Winged Angel. And it honestly sounds pretty cool.
You take one, I'll take the other.
Come on, Cloud. There's a tone to it that makes it feel intimidating, but not intimidating because he's evil Sephiroth. It's the exact opposite. It's intimidating because this dude is incredibly skilled and powerful and seemingly a good dude. So that version of the track I think is still pretty good. Obviously the classic will always be the original interpretation, but I do think that the remade versions that we get to hear in Remake and Rebirth and whatever the new version is going to be in Part 3 are all very well done and recreated, still with a lot of love and care, and still keep the essence of what Uematsu-san did in the OG. There's also the one that I think a lot of people really love from Advent Children, which has that heavy prog rock feeling to it that just feels so metal and intense, and to see Cloud and Sephiroth fighting with that heavy song scoring it, super cool. Up next, Uematsu-san talks about the changes in modern day video game music. Now, the original interview comes from realsound.jp, but we are going to be pulling from the Automaton translation. Now, when it comes to video game music feeling a little less weird, maybe a little less inspired, Uematsu thinks that maybe it's because a lot of game developers and producers maybe hold a little too much power. He would go on to say, I won't go as far as to call it stagnation, but I believe directors and producers hold too much power in their hands, even when it comes to the music. Even now, game composers aren't in a position to speak their opinion freely, and no matter how much musical knowledge or technical skills they possess, they're still in a position where it's difficult to speak their mind. There are almost no game producers who are well versed in worldwide entertainment and are familiar with a wide variety of musical genres, so anything goes for them as long as you make it sound like a John Williams movie soundtrack. He would then go on to cite one of his personal inspirations, Elton John, the Rocket Man. on how he feels that Elton probably had a similar pressure of keeping the status quo and making sure that he wrote songs that were, maybe mainstream, that would be hits, but he also was able to balance that with writing something that he was really into, that was different, that he was passionate about, instead of just doing the same old, same old. He still kept his creative and artistic liberties as he was making music. He continues on by encouraging young composers by saying, if you make the same stuff as John Williams and grow complacent with that, you'll get nothing more from it. Now, what if someone put a bit of techno in there? What kind of sound would it become then? I believe that would be a good way to approach music. And I do think Uematsu is right here. I think when you look at game development these days, specifically maybe with the bigger studios, everything really feels controlled and planned out and has to be a certain way. And oftentimes, maybe some of those developers don't value the musical side of these things, or they take it for granted. I think a really good example of that is Doom 2016, which was scored by Mick Gordon, who is an absolute legend in the industry. What that man is able to do, especially in Doom 2016, to create these songs that don't just play as you're going through the game and murdering demons, but the tracks themselves are dynamic. They know when to ramp up when you're in a boss battle, or maybe you're surrounded by some goons, which, to clarify, growing up the word goon meant something completely different than what it means today. How that changed, I don't know. Side tangent. But the way that game uses music, the way that Mick Gordon scores that game, it's so cool. It's so dynamic, and it feels like it accentuates the gameplay. It works side by side with the storytelling and the gameplay from the player to make an impactful experience. You gotta play Doom 2016 if you haven't, to really kind of understand what I'm saying here. Now, if you look at one of the later Doom sequels, Doom the Dark Ages, the music in that game is not bad, but it doesn't have that dynamic special touch to it that Mick Gordon did. And unfortunately, Mick was not brought back to score that game, so it was kind of missing that special piece when it came to the music. It wasn't bad music, but it just kind of felt like generic rock, where it's like, okay, you're gonna fight a boss, let's ramp up the energy and kind of score it that way. It just didn't really have that kind of love and care that Doom 2016 really had put into it. And much like Uematsu points out, a lot of these dev teams are massive, and some of the composers are afraid to speak their minds and be like, well, I think maybe things should be done this way, which I think is a leg up that Square Enix had with Final Fantasy back in the day, is starting off really small. It was a really small dev team. Everyone knew each other, worked together, could bounce ideas off of each other. So I think that created an environment where Uematsu-san was really comfortable with challenging the devs and being like, no, some songs have to be a certain way. And there's that hilarious classic story that comes to mind where Uematsu crafts the soundtrack for the first Final Fantasy game, and he plays it for Sakaguchi, and Sakaguchi's like, no, this isn't good, redo it, I need something better. So, being a little clever, Uematsu-san didn't rewrite the music, he just reordered the tracks and played it again for Sakaguchi-san. And Sakaguchi was like, this is great, I love it. So it just goes to show that the best case scenario is having a development team and an environment where everyone can speak their minds and work together. And I think that really is something that benefits the smaller dev teams. I think a really good example of that is Clair Obscur. It's an incredibly small dev team that worked on the core of the game. Granted, they had, hundreds of other people that worked on the game through outsourcing for like mocap and other things, but the core team that developed that game was incredibly small, and they were able to really collaborate with one another, and they didn't really have any red tape or higher ups to speak to. If they had an idea, they could bounce it off of somebody and it would probably end up in the game. And I think that's one of the reasons why the music is so good, is because much like Doom 2016 and Clair Obscur, the music scores that story. It perfectly accentuates the characters, the combat, the world exploration. It's also a soundtrack that, like Final Fantasy, is incredibly varied. The amount of different genres that you hear on the Clair Obscur soundtrack is super cool. One of my favorite tracks is In Lumiere's Name, which plays during some of the side quest boss battles, but you hear it every single time you fight the mimes. this really cool, funky, groovy beat that mixes accordion with like Spanish guitar and violins and synths, and it somehow all works together really well. And I think that speaks to that last line from Uematsu where he's like, yeah, you can make a John Williams-like soundtrack, who, for those of you who don't know, John Williams was the composer for the iconic franchise Star Wars, but if you just copy that, what's that really getting you? You got to add your own touch. And I love that he uses that example of what if there's a little bit of techno in there? Because that's Uematsu to a T. He loves Elton John. He was inspired by Jimi Hendrix and progressive rock. But the music he crafted wasn't just copying that. He was adding his own style, his own flair. He wasn't afraid to mix in some techno or use a MIDI instrument or organs or use, weird kind of sounding drum kits. He really experimented and it all just came out so incredibly unique. And I think that's one of the reasons why, to this day, all of his work stands the test of time, is because of how unique it is, but he actually put his heart and soul into crafting those songs. I think another really good example of that, and I've gushed about this game's soundtrack repeatedly, but that's the Final Fantasy VII Remake trilogy. These composers that are working on these games are tasked with taking Uematsu's classics and rearranging them, remixing them, redoing them. And they do it in a way that's respectful, it works, it brings the tracks up to a modern day to fit the new story. They still have the spirit of the original, but then they're able to create brand new original tracks that are also incredibly varied and different. The amount of genres on Rebirth's album alone is insane. You can have the beautiful orchestral stuff that sits alongside the funky music that plays in the Honeybee Inn in 7 Remake, all the way over to the incredible dance battle track, Fight for a Stamp in Rebirth, which I still listen to this day. I cannot get enough of that track. And it's because these composers are really allowed to just kind of experiment and do what they think could be best. And I think if you have a dev team that really trusts one another and allow the other people to really kind of experiment and have some sort of musical freedom, I really think that is like the best recipe for an incredible soundtrack that works perfectly in conjunction with gameplay, with story, with how the characters are motivated and eventually developed. His final words on the subject would include, the mainstream approach is to use soothing digital synth sounds with a sequencer, without ever letting it break that mold. Frankly speaking, there's less weird things now, which I think is also hitting the nail on the head. I think a lot of games these days just kind of focus less on having a soundtrack that tells a story or isn't afraid to experiment, and again would rather go with the more ambient kind of synth sounds, which for some games can work, but I don't know if they really stand out that much. I think an example on the opposite side of that, where ambient sounds actually work, would be Ghost of Tsushima. There are so many moments where you run around that world map and there's no music really playing. You're just kind of hearing the wind, you're hearing the animals, you're hearing a storm in the distance. But if you take a little bit of time to smell the roses, look at the ocean, music does creep its way in. It's this really beautiful Japanese-inspired music with these beautiful wind chimes and instruments I probably couldn't properly name, but they kick in at the right moment. And then there are situations in that game where you're in a big story battle and the music knows when to kick in and assist the player. It's almost like you're fighting alongside the music. It's acting as a secondary character in the character of Jin Sakai, who is the lead in Ghost of Tsushima, in his battle to save his homeland, which is super cool how music can work that way when it's really done right. And with that being said, that is the video. Anytime we get to hear from Uematsu-san on his thoughts on music, whether it's current day music or how he crafted some of his iconic tracks, I think is an absolutely beautiful thing. And thankfully, he's talked about this stuff quite a bit, whether it's in article form or on video, so we'll thankfully always have that. But with that being said, let me know in the comments down below what your thoughts are on what we covered in today's video, and I'd really love to know, Two things. What is your favorite final battle theme from a Final Fantasy? And what is your favorite Uematsu song, period? I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.